Hello. Looking over review of previous videos, it appears that those that have had the most viewers, most interest, have been those on the history of the Russian Germans. So I'm going to continue in that vein for today. This will be, I guess, part 5. And in this one, I'll try and cover some of the early Soviet period after the 1917 revolution. So the February 1917 revolution overthrows the Tsarist government. Provisional government under Alexander Kerensky comes to power, and the plans of the Tsarist government to forcibly deport all of the ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire into Siberia is shelved. Uh, the, the Russian government under the new leadership ends the plans to forcibly remove all of the ethnic Germans from Ukraine and Volga and deport them further eastward. Now, this government doesn't remain in power very long. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks under Lenin come to power, establish themselves in the major cities, particularly St. Petersburg, which becomes later renamed Leningrad after the Soviet leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and Moscow, and other major cities. And from 1918 to 1921, there's a civil war. But in March 1918, the Bolshevik government under Lenin takes the Russian Empire, what is now the RSFSR, really, out of the war with Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And in November 1918, Germany is defeated, and the World War I ends. But during this time between March and November 1918, much of the western parts of the former Russian Empire, including Ukraine, are under German rule. So it's quite chaotic, and I'm not going to go into all the details here of the myriads of the Civil War that is fought between 1918 and 1921 in the various territories of the former Russian Empire, including the RSFSR, Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia. But I will note that the German communities in the Volga, in the Black Sea region, particular, do attempt to politically organize themselves at this time for their own interest, and they do make the first steps of trying to assert political autonomy along a national basis. This doesn't get very far, in part because small minority, in part because of the chaos of the Civil War, and in part because of a variety of factors, but in particular because of the disproportionate wealth of many of the ethnic German farmers in the Volga and in the Ukraine. They become targets for various political factions in the Civil War for expropriation and massacre. In the Volga region, in particular, the Bolsheviks. In Ukraine, in addition to the Bolsheviks, there is a faction of anarchists under Nestor Makhno that is particularly hostile to the Mennonite community and deliberately targets them for a number of atrocities and expropriation of their property. Well, but in the end, of course, the anarchists are defeated and the Bolsheviks are triumphant in the various territories that had formed the Russian Empire, except for the Baltic states, Finland, and Poland. So Ukraine comes under rule of the Bolsheviks in 1921. It's only independent for 3 years. And a similar dynamic occurs in Transcaucasia in 1921. Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan come under Soviet rule. And attempts to succeed by these nationalities are defeated. So the territory of the Soviet Union, which formed in December 1922 officially, is a bit smaller than the Russian Empire, minus Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Bessarabia. Most of the core remains. And this also means that the Russian-German population, that is those descendants of immigrants that came in from Catherine II on, remain within within the Soviet Union for the most part. A few exceptions, but for instance in Bessarabia, but for the most part, of course, the Volga Germans come under Soviet rule. Most of the Black Sea Germans come under Soviet rule. The ethnic Germans in the Caucasus come under Soviet rule. Now, the expropriation by the Bolsheviks of grain, livestock, other food stores, eggs, chickens, as well as other wealth from German farmers, particularly in the Volga, but also in various parts of Ukraine, leads to famine, not just among the Germans, but the regions as a whole. But the Germans are one of the groups that suffer in particular. So there is a famine in the early 1920s. And this famine, we don't have exact figures, but certainly the number of ethnic Germans in the Volga and in the Black Sea region to die of famine from 1920 to 1921 is quite high. And the creation of the famine through expropriation of grain by the Bolsheviks and other factions during the Civil War, as well as peasant resistance to these policies, and movements for independence and autonomy by non-Russian nationalities, including movements for greater ethnic German autonomy, particularly in the Volga region, lead to two new Soviet policies. One is the new economic policy to end war communism and to allow kind of a private farming and private retail in the countryside, while just maintaining state control over industries and infrastructure, banking, what Lenin called the commanding height of the economy. But a mixed economy rather than a totally socialized one is formed, and one which, for the first time ever, for people in that are ethnically Russian in now what is the Soviet Union, free from any type of obligation to any type of nobility. But these will be replaced in the 1930s with obligations to the Koholz, collective farm system. But the Germans had always been free farmers, both in the Volga and in Ukraine and other areas. So in many senses, they were worse off, in particular because even though farming was now allowed to be free, the land redistributed to people actually farming it for the most part. The redistribution was ultimately based upon how much land you owned. And so for Germans, particularly in Ukraine, but also in places like Kyrgyzstan, the Mennonite communities in the Talas Valley, the Germans in Crimea, there was a loss of land. They had lost more land in the land reform than they gained by a large margin. The land was taken from them and given to other groups. Particularly in the non-Russian areas, such as Central Asia, redistribution of land to indigenous peoples from the German colonists. So they lost out on that. But the other part of the policy, or the other policy, besides the new economic policy instituted by the new Soviet government, a little bit later, a new economic policy is instituted in 1921. But the second policy instituted in 12th Party Congress in 1923, known as Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, literally taking of root. And this was an attempt to figure out a way to deal with the very large number of non-Russian nationalities in the Soviet Union, to provide a way of governing them without having them rebel along ethno-national lines against the still predominantly Russian power centered in Moscow under the Bolsheviks, now the Communist Party. And the way it would do this is to create kind of proto-states and national states where the language and culture of the indigenous nationality would be promoted, and members of that nationality would be promoted into the Communist Party and the government to rule the territory on behalf of Moscow. So it's basically indirect rule, something that we attribute to Lord Lugard, colonial ruler in Nigeria, taken to its logical conclusion. And this benefited almost every single non-Russian nationality in the Soviet Union, including the various ethnic German communities, but especially the Volga Germans. One of the first national territories created by the Bolsheviks is the Volga German autonomous, the Volga German Workers' Commune, which had the same status as what later would become an autonomous oblast, but it had later upgraded to the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. We have some dates here. Well, 19th of October 1918, the Bolsheviks had only been in power about a year, a little less. The Volga Germans get this autonomous territory, and then it is upgraded 20th of February 1924. It becomes an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, which is the second highest level for these national territories, the highest being the full Soviet Socialist Republic. And these territories supported various institutions, particularly educational institutions in the titular language, so German language schools, German language teachers' colleges, German language technical institutes. They also supported other institutions, particularly media, German language newspapers, German language radio, German language theater. Basically, the idea of socializing the population in their own language, the idea of creating a Soviet version of this nationality, so the idea of creating a Soviet Volga German man. This doesn't work for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into later, not in this particular video, which is coming to its natural end soon. But we did have this establishment of this territory. And then there are smaller territories on the district level, or the rayon level, established in Ukraine primarily, but also Crimea and Georgia and Azerbaijan for ethnic German communities there. And of course, their institutional support is on a much lower level than exists in the Volga-German ASSR. But we'll stop it there, and next time we'll get into exactly what was happening in these German autonomous territories, particularly the Volga-German ASSR, and how this was an attempt to develop kind of a German language, Soviet culture, and why it failed, why the Soviet government was unable to Sovietize the ethnic German population in the USSR, create kind of a Soviet German nation on the Volga, through the Volga-German ASSR, particularly why this failed when other attempts, for instance, attempts to create Central Asian nations such as Kyrgyzstan, were relatively successful, that they were able to make these into modern nation-state formations within the Soviet Union. So I'll leave it at that, and next time we'll talk about the Volga-German ASSR and other ethnic German communities in the USSR during the 1920s, the era of Korenizatsiya, and the new economic period. All right, I'll see everybody later.